Welcome to the Caffeine stream on caffeine and philosophy.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 15th episode of the Caffeine and Philosophy stream, the Caffeine stream. Can't say it. My name is C.B. Robertson, and today I'm talking with a very interesting guest. Clinton McMillan is the High Priest of Waldgang, and we're here to talk about religion, monotheism, monism, paganism, and what that might or might not have to do with Buddhism, Judaism, and language. Clinton, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, man.
We're here to after too wholesome of a conversation with Greg, we're here to annoy people again, because that's if you're not be irritated by some of the stuff you're hearing, there's a good chance you're not learning anything. You're just finding things to confirm your bias. Anyways, it's always good to go out there, and if you're lucky, you might even learn something new too. Now we've been hanging out on and off and chatting since 2013.
I think 2019 now. Yeah, I think that's the first time you came out to Waldgang, if I recall. Was it?
Well, there was the Waldgang before the Waldgang.
Yeah, the before times.
Yeah, before times. Yes. So you've been involved in this for fear of narrowing you into much alternative religious world and exploring that for quite some time now, and you're one of the more knowledgeable people in linguistics I know, which, some people look at me as like, oh, I know like 12 words of ancient Greek, so I'm this like super knowledgeable person. Nope, I just look things up sometimes. But Clinton is a guy who will hang out and he can recite whole passages in like reconstructed Proto-Indo-European or in Sanskrit and all this kinds of stuff. Extremely knowledgeable guy, and your research has led you down some very odd paths. It's sort of a consensus in the field that comparative linguistics sort of ends at Proto-Indo-European, but you seem to be taking things back at least a half a step further into Proto-Uralic, which is a very interesting. It's not something you hear a lot about. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
It's controversial. Uralic is one branch of it, but overall, looking back at the origin of the Proto-Indo-Europeans, or if we want to call them that, these multiple cultures along the steppe and everything, and also within Anatolia, they all derived from somewhere. Right. No one just pops up out of fucking nowhere. That's not how reality works. So I was looking more towards the Eurasianism, because we all know, based on genetic comparison, that most of the Eastern hunter-gatherers and the Western hunter-gatherers have ancient North Eurasian DNA. So there was a people before the proto-people that we're looking at least I'm looking at, and trying to see where the origins of some of the oldest religious beliefs are. It centers in Siberia, really. Siberia, Russia area, places that we don't really have access to. And during the time that the development of Proto-Indo-European was around, we didn't have access to, especially because of the Soviet Union.
Right. So how does reconstructing Proto-Uralic work? It sounds like reconstructing Proto-Indo-European is hard enough. How do we know? Proto-Indo-European is largely theoretical, based on common roots that these divergent languages like Greek, Latin, and Sanskrit have. Do we take a similar approach with Proto-Uralic and compare it to like Mongolian or something like that?
Yeah, and to be forward, it's a Proto-Eurasian or Eurasian language. So it's basically the same thing that Joseph Greenberg actually propagated. It's roughly around the same theory of Altaic, Nostratic, and stuff like that. So macro families. So when we're talking about that, it does include Mongolic languages, Turkic languages, and Uralic languages within it. As far as the overall structure, you can't anticipate that. Like you can only project what it might be based on the existing languages. What I typically am concerned with is root words. because root words will inevitably show commonalities. Within etymology and within linguistics, there's this, especially I would say Western academia, there's a stopping point at Indo-European, and that there's no such connection between East and East and West. They don't like that comparison for whatever reason. But when you present roots, that there's like at least 38 forms of the same word and the same meaning and the same dental, sounds like there's a connection across all cultures.
Right. So this is where the rubber, this sounds very abstract and academic and like, oh, that's very interesting. You like scholars can go debate how many angels can dance on the head of this pin or whatever over there, until the rubber meets the road with belief. And that's where things get interesting. So like one of the, so you've been exploring like ancient Buddhist stuff, which doesn't look a lot like Buddhism that we see today.
No.
But you've also been exploring the etymological origins of Yaweh in the pre-Christian Hebrew or Jewish tradition. I think Hebrew is the proper term. Jews were just one tribe. Can you explain how Yaweh ties in with all that, and explain if I'm pronouncing that correctly?
You are. Originally, so I got into the Yaweh thing looking into it through, comparative religion. I was looking at the commonalities between Skyfather Thunderers, because at an original point within human history, they were one. The split that we see within Indo-European religions that's a late figure. And it most likely derives from some action. And so there's a presiding Skyfather, that the thunder is an action that thereby became deified in a sense. So the cause and effect type of thing.
So there's the origin point, and then there's the action itself, and both of them became independently deified, but the connection is retained.
Exactly. And you can see this, and this is actually a really funny part, because I was looking at Vedic, and I found it hilarious because they have this root word for like Thor. I was trying to find the root form for Thor, and it came up as Stenha. And I was like, well, that doesn't make any fucking sense because there's no S. Found out it was called an S mobile, which means it's a genitive case. It means something that is owned by something or something that is used. So it's a something's thunder.
Oh, interesting.
So this is repeated mostly throughout Lithuanian and then Sanskrit languages.
Now, when the possibility of that kind of genitive modifier can be introduced, does that throw a whole like wrench in the gears of etymological deconstruction and reconstruction if things like that can happen? Does that does etymology really become like evolutionary psychology, where it's just a sort of guessing game backwards, or are there rules that are more followable than that?
When you look at it, I mean, there's a lot of rules for reconstruction that academics have made.
More like guidelines.
Yeah, guidelines. I don't have to follow them. I don't have their special sticker.
Right.
But the way I trace that back is I actually took away the S, and I started looking in other languages.
Okay.
So what that means is it's called an S mobile, and it just is at the front of the word because that implies a genitive. So it, as compared to like on the end of like, let's say it's Deus Tanha, so it'd be Deus's thunder, God's thunder.
Okay.
So you take that away,
Deus.
you have the primal root.
So is that sorry, for Deus, would that be real? Isn't that a different word than the Skyfather we're familiar with Deus Pater?
Deus Pater, I mean, there's Deus, Deus, all sorts of these things. And they all, I mean, it really is interchangeable. Deus Pater comes from Jupiter, or Deus Pater in the Mediterranean languages. And then you have Sanskrit as well, Deus Pitar or Pitar. So those ones kind of propagate over there, but it's interchangeable. Literally just means sky father.
Right.
literally.
So that's not the genitive ownership thing then.
No, because it just
Okay.
means, it's more of a noun, so to that end, it's just like a nominative type of name. That's all it is.
Oh, it occurred to me though to rewind a second. You said
Mhm.
you said Thor was the Sky Father or the Thunder. I was under the impression that Odin was the Sky Father. That Odin was the is there some complications here in the history that I'm not or can you
Yeah, I
enlighten us
mean,
about that?
the problem with comparative religion and mythology is the fact that you see late, especially within the Germanic sense, everything we have is really late. There's nothing really authentic, but you see like the common form of the most widely worshipped god is Thor.
Yeah. Well, and also, didn't the Romans, when they were introduced to the Germanic gods, they said, "Oh, Odin is Hermes."
Yeah.
They compared him to the psychopomp. They didn't immediately compare him to Apollo or Zeus or any of the other possible sky fathers.
Mhm. I think that where they actually denoted Hercules, I actually think that that's what they're talking about Thor, because they actually had amulets that they would wear that were in the shape of hammers, Hercules pillars and whatnot. They would have little amulets, or I think they called them donar pillars or whatever, donar necklaces. I forget the actual. I think it's donarcula. Don't quote me on that. I'll have to double check. But they would wear them, and they found them at burials, and that is a proto form of the hammer pendant if you look at it. But Hercules and Jupiter were both worshipped in pillar form. Especially Jupiter was worshipped in Germania as Jupiter Dolicensis, or Delicanus, I should say, which is technically a Syrian religion. Well, Anatolian, if you want to get specific.
Interesting. So none of these things are as isolated and separate and their own thing as they are often depicted.
Well, mythology, typically speaking, is not religion. So that's the other thing. It doesn't denote praxis. So, like, you look at, for instance, theogony. That's not the religion. I mean, that was a mythopoetic form. It's an epic.
Right.
Whereas, like, you look
Homer
at
is not religion.
exactly. It may have
Yeah.
religious elements within it, but that does not mean it is like a Bible. And that's what a lot of people see mythology as. I mean, I've been through my fair share of Osseter kindreds that treat the Edda like a Bible, which is the most adorable thing I've ever seen. But the problem is when you have late forms. You can tell a lot about a culture by its folklore, and you can also tell a lot about their surviving customs, but also through just historical chronological events.
Yeah. Well, and it's sometimes you can tell a lot about them, but oftentimes what you can tell is not direct either. There's that famous Nietzsche line about how laws more accurately describe the character of a nation's neighbors than of the nation itself. They're describing how a nation differentiates and delineates itself in relation to a sort of Schmittian other. And it's also often a kind of via negativa relationship between laws and even myths and a nation's sense of identity. We don't do that. We don't eat pork. We don't eat cow or whatever.
It basically is saying like, no, this is what we do. That's not what we do because we do this. That's exactly what it is. And I think with that too, I think mythology is roughly the same way, especially the lower forms. That's why we have to kind of compare and look at the things that have survived. Strong beliefs don't die. In my opinion, there's a very good reason why the Goths were so easily converted to Christianity and embraced it, because at that time, God the Father was God the Father, very Old Testament. So it's very, you look at like how they lived their life and what they turned to, it usually mirrors what they already had for the most part.
Right. Yeah. No, for sure. And and it's also interesting looking back historically at the relationship between religion and language too, because oftentimes it seems as though the beliefs are themselves shaped by the language and are in some sense products of it. There's a lot of chicken and egg questions, and which came first, the religion or the language, or did the ritual create the language, or did the ritual create the religion, or did the religion create the ritual, which then creates the language? Or and there's some degree of truth to all of those ones. But which came like primordially first can be a very difficult question. But
I think that's the question we're always going to ask. I don't think unless
right.
we have some way to kind of really see it, or quantify it, we're never going to really know. That's the problem.
Right. Yeah. And it's still fun to try to compose theoretical answers, or at least, plausible explanations for which ones might or might not have been primary causes.
Mm. And I would agree with that. I mean, I do a lot of it.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of my, current research is like original monotheism or monism, looking back at seeing like the earliest religious forms and seeing what are the commonalities, how do we kind of see what they were, what were the practices, why did they worship these things?
Now, before we started recording, we were talking a little bit about the Rig Veda. And can you explain briefly? I'm gonna be a little bit of a 5-year-old here for the sake of conversation, but how can monism make sense if just in this one text, which is one of the oldest mythical texts we have, we're off the bat, we're talking about different gods? Isn't Agni a different god than Brahma and Indra? How can monism make sense in the context of these different gods here?
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because they actually, within the Rig Veda itself in the later editions, actually promotes monism and pantheism, because it's actually, I'll have to pull up the exact quote for you later on, but it actually denotes that which the sages, call different deities is but one deity, but one god, and his name is Indra, Mitra, Agni, Yama, etc. So it actually promotes that.
So we've got a multifaceted, much more kaleidoscopic version of the origin and the strike that we were talking about earlier, but across the whole world. Is that the idea?
Yeah, in a sense. It basically, they're talking about universal forms, because I think the main issue that a lot of people have when they read it, they look at it through current Hindu religions. Current meaning. So anthropomorphic deities, physical deities, and stuff like that. They're not looking at it in terms of, let's say, 6,000 years ago. What would Agni be 6,000 years ago? Did they have depictions of human forms 6,000 years ago? No, they didn't. So it would have been literal fire. It would have been, Indra, which would have been literal thunder or sky, and then Varuna, or Varuna, I should say, and it would be, the celestial sky. So they're literal things, and we have to kind of take a step back. And this is where we have kind of almost a discussion about anthropomorphism, or anthropomorphic forms. Taking a step back gives us an ability to understand it more outside of ourselves. And they're talking about more animistic ideas. And I want to say animistic lightly, because animism cannot be placed on everything, but it's more pantheistic in the terms of, these are expressions of reality, of the divine, which to that end, I would say early Rig Vedic religion is pantheistic, or at least panentheistic in a sense.
Okay. That's an interesting take, and it's one that you can, spend a ton of time meditating on. The thought that comes to my head is, the thing that, Homer wrote about in the Iliad, where even the gods are at war with each other. Socrates famously pointed this out in his Euthyphro dilemmas. Like, the gods themselves don't agree on everything, so how can morality come from the gods? And it's how in what way does it make sense to think of the gods as one if there is competition, not even among the gods, but in the universe generally? And is that in some way comparable to the many facets of a, I don't want to, underhand pitch this too slow, but like to the different facets of a human individual and how we may be torn on our own decisions, or is it a different kind of comparison there?
I mean, I think it's going to be a difficult kind of like definitive answer, but what I would say is this: is monism is essentially, when we talk about monism, it's talking about one universe. So it's like monotheism too. We have to understand what theism means,
Right.
that which is set in place. So it's stating that it's not really a belief, but it's that which is set in place by the original root of de. Okay, so I look at it more from an, again, etymological standpoint, saying, okay, this is what is set in place. This is one thing set in place, and that's what monism means. It's one. It's just one form. So it's saying that there are not multiple forms, or the multitude is not important. They exist within this one form. So I mean,
Okay.
That's one thing that I think a lot of pagan religions also have a problem with, is that they have many deities, they have many realms, they have many things. Yes. Multitude does not mean, or multiplicity does not make it better at all. Realistically, it's understanding that these things kind of have an ebb and flow, and actually they're tensions with each other. If we're talking about the gods, back to that point, they're always fighting. They're tensions of reality. I would say a lot of these are materializations, elemental materializations that are in constant conflict, because that's reality. We take myth out of it and we go out into nature. How many things are in conflict every fucking day?
All of them.
All of them. So it's a constant struggle. It's actually one of the things why Heraclitus, war is the father of all. The war that he term, I think he uses polemos, which is tension, struggle. So that's where he talks about, tension. Everything is in conflict with one another. It's not literal war. It's tension and conflict. And I think that that's really how reality works.
Yeah. Now, and it's one of the things that has turned me off about another fun segue here about Buddhism is the pacifism and benevolence of modern Buddhism. Seems very opposed to that, seeking to escape the cycle of suffering and conflict and all that. Is that accurate, or is that mischaracterizing something core in
depends on the Buddhism you're talking about?
Oh, I was hoping for something more fiery there.
No, I think
you're too honest.
Most Buddhism today is absolute bullshit. That's absolute fucking bullshit. I mean,
there's the fire. I was like,
it's you see, like I would say Vajrayana. Vajrayana is a theocratic religion, 100%. I mean, the Dalai Lama is a theocrat. He's a theocrat in exile, if you will. But they really, Vajrayana is one thing, and that's very materialistic or pseudo-spiritual. It's pseudo-spiritual. It's not even, it's technically pagan.
So what do you mean by pseudo-spiritual? Because that's a very interesting subject on its own. And what counts as spiritual is a very, to me, a very interesting question as well.
So for them, they talk about more so utilizing the material as spiritual expressions. And essentially, how do I word this correctly? Using them to suit the Dharma's will. So using material gain to essentially spread the Dharma, which is the law of Buddhism, the truths of the Buddha. Which one, who's to fucking say, because there's 1,001 different fucking Buddhas. And apparently they're all the same one, which makes absolutely no fucking sense to me. But that's besides the point. But then you look at the escapism concept. It's a lot of it is escapism of negative emotion in its original sense. And negative formats within the mind, or forms within the mind, I should say, that eat away at you and cause more suffering. But the problem is when you look at the words used, they're not talking about suffering. They're talking about instability of the world, instability of self. It's more about mastery of the original Buddhism, I should say. Like early pre-sectarian Buddhism is more about mastery of oneself rather than escaping the world.
So the modern sort of emotional self-psychotherapy version of Buddhism that we see today that focuses on negative emotion, you're saying is coming out of basically a bad translation of, I forget the word exactly for suffering that they use. It's something very precise.
Dukkha.
Dukkha. Yes, that's right. I love having my language. Yes. So you're saying dukkha has more to do with instability than suffering.
Yeah. So I would say, look at it this way. So it actually refers back to an axle. So ka, I think it's ka actually refers back to an axle of a chariot, of a wheel, things that hold things together. So sukha means a good axle or a good wheel. And then dukkha means a bad wheel.
Interesting. So it's not even implying a bad mental state, but poor function.
Yes.
Like,
so that's why they have like so much asceticism, even though they
right.
disregard asceticism for the most part. Accordingly, most of them do it anyway. If you're a monastic, you're fucking ascetic. Let's just face it. You're not living life as a human, in my opinion.
Yeah. And so, yeah, right. And so you can immediately see an intuitive connection between how negative emotional states, but you'd have to be very precise about how you define negative there, could lead to dysfunction. But negative would be negative insofar as it causes dysfunction. And implied in that is a theory of what a functional person, how they operate.
Exactly. And that's the funny thing is, like all religions, they got capitalized on, and it basically they have many classifications for what is good and bad emotions, you know. It's funny because modern Buddhism actually talks about compassion a lot. And historically, the Buddha was not compassionate. He was kind of a fucking dick.
Well, and compassion is just by itself such an interestingly misunderstood and misapplied word we hear today. Yeah, I think we were hanging out a couple months ago, and you pointed out that compassion means to come down and suffer with. It doesn't mean, vain expressions of sympathy or however it's used today.
Yeah, it's one of those things with literally compassion, to suffer with someone. And it's like, well, compassion is okay. They use it today as, feeling someone else's pain. I mean, feeling their emotions or being kind to them. It's okay to be kind, but you'll be goddamned if I'm going to suffer with you. If you're going through some shit, that's usually your own bullshit.
Yeah. Well, and and insofar as it's descriptive in that way, it's often not even a choice. It's a neurological response. Like when you get, watch some horrible snuff film that's going around Instagram of someone getting stabbed.
Hey man, why
are
you watching that shit? Are you feeling some guilt over there?
Well, yeah, we all have to get off somehow. But when you see, some video of a guy trying to leap over a counter in Vegas and getting stabbed a few times, your body naturally wants to cringe and like, you see some video of some guy who tries to jump off a diving board and hits the side of the pool, and your whole body does one of those, like, oh God. It's not a.
Is this how you tell me you're sensitive?
I am sensitive, but it's not that's not a moral reaction. There's nothing to be proud of or ashamed of necessarily in that response, although it might in some cases be a good practice to train yourself to respond better in anticipation of certain events. But it's a natural way that our brains are wired, and there's no moral content to that kind of empathy in my view. I don't know if that's what they're talking about today with compassion, but it's one of those aspects of the term as it's used today that I think is
it's not. I don't think it's applicable. With the word that they use, karuna, is just your actions. It's just about action,
okay,
moral action. So righteous action.
So righteous action. Okay, and what does that look like in old Buddhism?
Old Buddhism is more about maintaining of the self. It's not even the self, because now they Neo-Buddhism, I would say, and like later Buddhism with the Shunyata school, they essentially negate the self, which technically the Buddha never talked about at all. That wasn't a thing.
Really?
No. It wasn't actually within any of their original sutras or suttas, I should say, in the Pali. They don't have that. They talk about self in a very mind setting. And you have to understand context of Indian religions at that point too, of what they mean. Atman. They're talking about eternal self within the Upanishadic sense.
So like this almost sounds like it's related to the immortal soul that Socrates was talking about.
Yeah, and within Buddhism, they don't really, at least the Shunyata school, they deny that. So they deny any sort of self, any sort of immortal self. You are a aggregate or a compounding thing that is completely like always moving, and you are not one thing but many. So your mind, your body, your voice, you are a multitude. And to that end, they prioritize the multitude as making it almost negating the entirety.
So here I want to ask you about who I think is your favorite philosopher and perhaps religious leader here, and the paradox of the many versus the one that we see in Heraclitus and his most famous passage about, a man cannot step in the same river twice because he is not the same man and it is not the same river. How can in that one line, Heraclitus is describing a man as being one but many, and the river, of course, also being one but many. Does that give any insight into the relationship between monism and the clear distinctions that we see in the world as we experience it?
Yeah, I mean, I actually think it sums it up perfectly. The main reason with monism is talking about one cosmos. There's not many, but there's one existing form at all points. There's many within it, always. We can't deny that. But they're always in movement and in tandem with each other, sometimes in conflict. So it's always changing at all points, always. It never stops changing. And that's kind of the feature, is the only constant is change. And he said that himself. It's actually, I would say, a lot of his influence likely came from early Buddhism. And a lot of the early philosophers, they mirror a lot of the things being said at the time over in the East, which is interesting. And they all talk about, reality as being one. We can say that, yes, reality is one. It's not saying that it's, I am you and you are me. It's not what that's saying. You are a separate individual from me. But
right,
things within reality that are one. Change is one. Reality is one.
And this oneness is identical with God, is the idea, correct?
Yeah. So reality, to that end, if we're talking about the Stoic theology, Zeus is the divine mind. The reality that we inhabit right now is the divine mind. It is God. And that's where the pantheistic approach comes in, because they're actually what's called corporealists. They don't really believe or believed in external realities, or they didn't prioritize it at all. So this reality is what we have, and this is what we can study. Anything else is just merely anticipation. That's it. And so God is within this one reality, and it moves through all things. Its essence is movement, is life. Okay. And the oneness that they talk about, actually, I would say derives from esoteric principles within, early Greek mystery cult as well, because we see this repeated within, the Derveni texts as well, where they talk about Zeus as being one, and many Gnostics as well later on use Yaweh and Zeus as a oneness being. Now they call him the demiurge, but it's talking about reality as one mind, one thing consistently, but it moves within. So the way I think about it is, imagine all the things that move within your mind, that is phenomena. Imagine the firmament as the deity's mind, or the cosmos as the deity's mind, and all things that move within it are its thoughts.
Okay. So kind of a the consciousness within the universe that is comprised of the connections of the universe, of disparate things.
Yeah, exactly. And so it moves these things, and there's a kernel of that spiritual essence, that seed of the logos, if you will, within all things. And the logos being the order of reality, or their divine order, something that we will never fully know, but it consistently comes back again and again in a certain cause and effect form.
Okay, because it is the context within which, all action or motion either originates from or is in response to, which is kind of the same thing, I guess, in a sense. And so by being the context, it is the source. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, exactly. So
Okay.
the source itself, you can't locate it. Like, you can't say this God did that. This God is original. It is reality, the cosmos. The mere movement of the whole is the God.
So this this no doubt sounds extremely esoteric and boring and uninteresting and unuseful to some number of people who will listen to this. But this understanding sort of brings it back to, how is this applicable? How is this useful to someone? Because by contrast with that kind of, and that view of monism, pantheism, no matter how many gods you invent and anthropomorphize into existence, there will always be something that you leave out. There will always be something that you don't account for.
Mm-hmm.
And monism, that view of looking at the whole of the forces, however great or small in relation to each other, at least leaves your mind open to things that an unnecessarily limited pantheon might not have prepared you to anticipate or think about.
Yeah, and at that point, it's about interpretation, because when we look at like mythology, mankind is making up these forms, these personalities, these characters.
Of course,
they are our projections onto the cosmos. That's what they are.
Yeah, and there's some. I think I'm convinced that there is some utility to that, because we think better in terms of personalities than we do in terms of abstract concepts. It's easier to remember a face and a name than it is to remember 32 degrees Celsius, 15 degrees north wind, or something.
I mean, I'm not gonna fucking remember that. That's gonna be
like these abstract ideas are, you listen to these like memory champion people will remember facts and poetry and stuff by visualizing it, by transforming abstract information into spatial information, which is easy to remember. And I think some degree of anthropomorphization is a product of that. We're better at remembering and being mindful of personalities because of our social pack animal nature. But it's easy.
I would say so, yeah.
It's easy to forget that and to mistake the anthropomorphizations for reality and the things themselves. And monism seems like a nice cure to that tendency towards and pathology, I think.
In my opinion, it actually is original. I think that's one of the reasons why I agree with the monism or monotheism sense, because humanity creates these things for relation and representation. That's what we do, because we need a face to remember ourselves. That's the main problem. I'm not only going to say it's a problem, but it's something that we inherently do. Some of the first anthropomorphic forms that we ever see are actually of man-like lions in Germany. I'll have to show you that, because it's actually quite interesting. It's thousands of years old, but I think it's for relating one another to a thing, saying this is me, but in this format, and that's what we're trying to do. That's what we're saying. This is what a god is. Okay. This is what a form is. This is the man doing this, but it helps us kind of conceptualize it, inherently, because we're human and we need relational forms. That's why Sky Father. What does a father do?
I want to make a furry joke, but I'm going to abstain.
I mean,
combining forms.
That's what you're doing, man. I mean, god damn. You let a lot of things loose, man.
No, it is interesting though. And who is the famous, was it Zeno, who said that if zebras had gods, they'd be in the shape of zebras and so forth. And that would also be an expression of the relation, but maybe zebras would make reverse man minotaurs or centaurs or whatever, to express that'd be
fucking interesting, actually. I want to see that shit.
their relationship with these bipedal hunters. on the savannah or whatnot.
I think as animals, we would inevitably do it. No matter what being comes about, we would inevitably do it. But my main gripe of it is usually when it limits the form and it turns into more of worshiping of the image itself, and not understanding the context of what it represents.
Mm-hmm.
This thing is not fire. It does not control fire, because you cannot place fire in the body of a man. You know what I mean?
Right.
You can't contain thunder in the body of a man. So it's representational, kind of like I would say the Greek Orthodox icons. It's very similar to that. Their argument actually, in a sense, does kind of go right into this. It's good for artistic representation, but it doesn't, hold the whole truth at the end of the day.
Yeah, I've been playtesting this argument with, and it works best with the Orthodox Christian, which I think are in many ways the best form. I don't want to tell them that, because then their head will get even bigger than it already is. But they really do have a good thing going. My playtesting argument I've been trying is, Bishop Robert Barron would say that, paganism is good, but you can take it one step further. It gets even better in Christianity. And I like to invert that and say, Christianity is good, is beautiful, but it does go one step too far. It goes one step too far. It has taken the good in the pre-Christian myth and tradition, and it's taken it to this extreme that is still beautiful and still has that kernel of good, but you can come back from that and actually get a broader and more complete experience of life and practice in life.
The problem I have with it is mostly the atonement, because they do have everything on point in terms of mythology and theology. I mean, I have an acquaintance where, I agree with most of the theology, but I reject the incarnation.
The doctrine of being in need of salvation and atonement in the first place.
So. I don't agree with any of that, because fundamentally, reality tests us, and if reality is God, then God wants us to be tested at all fucking times. He wants us to be sharp. He wants us to be strong, not cower before and bend the knee.
Now, I on the one hand, I love that view. I love that perspective. However, are we in danger of anthropomorphizing there and misunderstanding of being accused as Job's friends were in Job 40 of speaking falsely of God by attributing this kind of conscious will to him as far as what he wants of us?
I think that anything that is written down in terms of theology is man-made anyway. You have to look at reality itself. You have to go out and see the natural phenomena, and that's what really defines the nature of God.
So you're saying just the experience of nature and our direct observation is like, clearly we were designed to compete and to fight and to sharpen ourselves. It's the observable law of existence. Okay.
Because anything else is just mental fucking masturbation, and it's usually just following rules that were written by some fucking redneck in the desert. Like, some dude who probably fucked a sister or some shit. So they had some F sons, who knows? But so, that's one of the things I think that mankind has a habit of doing that. And I know why we do it. And we have tradition for a reason. This is just, we have it because it sets the tone for society. That's what tradition is. It sets the tone for society and for our general people. It's
learning more about the words spoken by people thousands of years ago, and at the same time dismissing them as sister fucking rednecks in one podcast. And that's how it's always been. Which is what I love. That's how not Homer's a little bit nicer, but there was another poet who was as famous as Homer, Archilochus, who had zero fear of self-contradiction, or really apparent self-contradiction. Most of the time when smart people appear to be contradicting themselves, they're not. It's just people misunderstanding the essence of what they're saying. But this is how people have always been. And finding those apparent paradoxes and apparent contradictions is a great way to practice getting to the heart of what's really being said.
And that is a lot of people latch on to things that are said as gospel. That's the thing, where they're not thinking about the essence, or they're taking it face value.
Yeah.
You know, they're taking like the literal words, what you're saying, and not understanding context or the backdrop behind it, or what incited that thought. And that's just human nature, I think, though, too. I mean,
Yes.
it happens to me all the time, and I'm just like, no, you're not fucking listening to what I'm saying.
Yeah. It's like the Tao Te Ching, that Tao which can be spoken is not the true and eternal Tao. And that's another book that doesn't fear contradicting itself.
And contradiction is interesting. I mean, contradiction, the Taoism is interesting, and I haven't gone super deep into it because a lot of it's very vague. Very vague, and then it gets too saturated with Alan Watts, which, no thanks.
I mean, you do have to. I will say I have an uncle who is an Orthodox priest. Absolutely amazing guy. He was the one who introduced me to Greg Nosh, actually.
That's interesting, actually.
But he has gotten into Taoism. I think his argument has a very strong belief that it had to do Orthodox with Christianity and Taoism. The similarity between the concept of God in Orthodox Christianity and the concept of God in Taoism. He referenced
interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, we both know that most of the theology behind Orthodox Christianity does derive from the Greek. So I think that actually makes a lot of sense. But there is within Taoism too, in the nature of God, in the little I know of Taoism, actually, it reminds me of the Shangdi religion within China, which is their imperial skyfather religion. It was, in a sense, monistic, or at least panentheistic, with a central feature similar to the Stoics of the heavens as being the divine force, the representation of all reality.
Yeah. Well, and this sort of to tie it back to the linguistic stuff too. One of the fun things about comparative religion, as with comparative, maybe even more so than with comparative mythology, is, it's fun to find the similarities and say, oh, common origin. But it gets really interesting, I think, when you find religions with clearly no, at least no apparent common linguistic origin. Like, you have to stretch really hard to find an origin, a comparable origin with Chinese and Greek. And
when you surprised, actually,
well, perhaps them. I mean, I guess if we go far enough back, we would be talking, common ancestry in Africa or wherever. But at a so much else changes, in human culture and in human language patterns, that it would be surprising if religion didn't change too. And when you find cultures that are so unlike come to, at least in certain places, similarities, that's always a point of interest. One of the things Dr. Naj mentioned as a I did it again, that Greg mentioned, was the existence of syncretic etymologies, and how it's not just words inheriting meaning as words evolve over time, but also new meanings emerging from words based on the sounds.
So I mean, there's definitely the sound symbolism too. I would say that's really where most language comes from. Sound symbolism. I would say the majority of certain thunder gods, it comes from sound.
The sound of the thunder.
Sound itself. I mean, the thing itself, and where the sound derives from. We see, throughout history, words change, etymology changes. There's also, folk etymology and false etymology, which people love to talk about within the linguistic realm.
It's almost enough to make me wonder if the universality of the thundering Skyfather is sort of a byproduct of that syncretic etymology that you just described.
I mean, I think it is. I mean, I think also we live under one fucking sky, and I mean, certain areas have different skies. I mean, I know that we've had conversations where it has that. With some people in the chat, in the solar chat, has
The
arisen.
Western Washington is does not have the best sky. We'll just leave it at that.
No, no, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. I mean, I wish it had more thunder. Whoo boy.
Yeah.
But no, it's one of those things. I think we all have seen it as a species, and all throughout this, reality, we've seen it. So it's going to be a universal form because it's always above us at all times. We've just described it in different ways, in ways we could describe it. That's the other thing. So words will change always as new complex features within society and living situations come about. So nomadic peoples will worship the sky differently than, let's say, a settled people, and historically they have. Same thing with, like, let's say a hunter-gatherer tribe probably worshipped it in a different way, if they did at all. If their worship was the same worship that, or same thing that we would attribute as worship today.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's always been an interesting one. I've noticed among certain Christian preachers and ministers, worship can be used in a couple different ways, and sometimes interchangeably, sometimes in a kind of equivocal fashion, where they'll say it's not real worship unless you're doing these correct things and are coming with the right mindset and the right heart and so forth. But then at the same time, if they're talking about idols or false gods, all kinds of things suddenly become worship. And it seems very possible that people 6, 7, 8,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago, sitting out under the sky watching the thunderstorm roll over, could be understood and interpreted and perhaps even described later as a kind of worship in that awe, looking upward direction of the eyes and attention.
I think that, I mean, in my own personal experience, experience of reality in nature is the highest form of worship, because you understand what worship really means at that end, which is making worthy of something. You understand it, like
worthship.
Worthship or worship. Yeah, we actually can go out and appreciate and find worth in this form that we're seeing in front of us. We've all seen a sunset that has never happened again in the same way, and understood that's beautiful. I think every person has seen that. To me,
appreciation.
It's like a numinous form of worship. It's almost appreciating the numinous form of it, and it's almost like a wonder, in a sense, looking at it in wonder. And in that sense, I would say it's wordless. It doesn't really have much ritual action. Ritual action comes from social setting.
Yeah, that's ritual. In many ways is almost the antithesis of worship then, which is not to say it's not valuable, but they seem to be different then, because
they have different formats. I'd say that they're very similar but different goals. So I would say that the primal form of worship, and we're going to call it that, of wonder and awe or dread, that's another thing that we need to remember. Very primal thing.
All the Christians are like, the fear of the Lord is the sign of
I mean, I think that shit's pretty fun.
Yeah.
But ritual action takes place in a social setting. It's supposed to repeat something within myth. That's always how it's been. We repeat the actions because either God does it, a mediator does it, or we're imitating the gods themselves. We become the gods by doing this imitation.
So we have ritual reenacts myth. Myth narrativizes the gods and the cosmos in relation to things that we worship, and then we have this kind of cycle of worship, myth, ritual, and life that in a circular fashion carries all that forward.
Yeah, and that's what I mean. In most people, I mean, you look at early religions too. Their societies were defined by them. They just did the things. They didn't say, "Oh, we're pagan, we're a Christian, whatever." I mean, Christians would have, but they wouldn't say, "Oh, we're this denomination of pagan." They just say, "No, this is what we do. This is our custom."
Yeah,
I don't know anything else.
I got to study Goju karate for about 3 months before freaking COVID shut it down. But
big Chinese coof.
Yeah, it was funny though, because Goju was created as a subdiscipline, or a form of karate taught by one guy who learned in China first and then brought it back to Okinawa. And after teaching for like 30 years or 40 years or so, someone asked him, "What do you call this style?" And he was like, it's just fighting." And he didn't have a name for it. And so he came up with a name for it on the spot. It's like, sometimes you move fast and sometimes slow. Fast, slow, Goju. It's Goju fighting. And like the name was completely unnecessary for the actual practice of the thing. And it is interesting how many people today, and I've certainly fallen into this, and it's fun to do sometimes, lean into pagan as an identity, as a sort of overt sign of rejection of Christianity, but also rejecting atheism. And it's like, we don't want either of those two things, so we're going to lead with the name. And it is it does seem to be one of the points at the heart of what you're describing, this monism, as well as Taoism and this primordial Buddhism and this general religion project that you've been pursuing, that the name is really secondary. The words are used to describe the thing, but are not the thing itself.
Yeah, it's only classification because human needs classification. I mean, in 100 years, who knows what religions are going to be called? Like, maybe we don't have fucking books. We don't have, like, who knows? Like,
we're halfway there already with Kindles and
exactly. So
and podcasts like this,
right? But it's things aren't going to be said because historically things weren't said that way. I mean, they only became they're defined by what, again, isn't them. Okay, and that's how Christianity defines themselves. That's how pagans now define themselves as, oh, we're pagan. That means we're not Christian. And they use it, paganism, technically speaking, as a denomination, only exists in the reality of Christianity. That's it.
Yes.
That's fucking it.
And, like the myths and laws we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, and it only exists in terms of the conflict in its opposition. I mean, pagus, I've written a short little thing about this some years ago. I think it was some years ago, but whatever. Pagus literally just means attached to it. It's a settlement. It's an attachment of a settlement, like I would say like a shire, if you will.
Yeah.
It literally means a rural place. People who live in a rural area, rural settlements, and it's an attachment from it. So let's say it's attached by roads and it leads to another attachment, which is another town. And it's people who live there. That's all it means. It means fucking redneck. That's all it fucking means. And
people who live there.
You have these centralized people, this religion, Christianity or whatever, who is an urban religion. Christianity is an urban religion, 100%. Right. And now they're looking at these fucking rednecks out there and be like, we need to fucking get those guys. Fuck those guys. They keep taking our barley. They keep taking our fucking cows. They won't listen to us.
Paganus, the frickin' redneck, which is funny because it's like a completely different word, but at the same time exactly the same word as heathen, the heath dwellers.
Exactly. It's the same
the people out there, away from the city.
People fuck out there, and that's the thing too, is because it's all about centralized, authority, but also centralized ideology. That's the other thing too. I would say most fucking pagans today aren't even pagan because first off, they don't live in the fucking woods. They don't live in a settlement or a farm. Right. They don't actually live the way that the word defines. And that's the problem. It's not a belief system. It's not about being like believing in gods. That's
it's a lifestyle, really, more than anything else.
Exactly.
or a way of life. Lifestyle sounds too kitschy. It's a way of life and an environment that goes along with it. It seems
Exactly.
like.
Well, it's a reality that's lived. That's the
Mhm.
whole thing. It's a reality that's lived. It's not when you
Yeah.
say, "Oh, I'm a pagan because I believe in these gods." That doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
It it doesn't mean anything.
It's like you're a pagan because harvest season actually means something that you experience, and elk season means something, and like dealing with the snow is a problem, not like oh, I might have a day off of school or whatever.
Yeah, and so it's that's the dichotomy. And actually, I mean, really, we see that dichotomy today within the world. We see urban dwellers and then rural folk. That is a huge thing too. It's the same dichotomy. It always will be.
Yeah.
So Christianity and all these other religions are urban religions, despite what some people might say. But it's thoroughly defined within the populace that way,
Yeah.
in center sprawls.
And so I don't want to keep you too long, but I do want to ask, do you have an opinion on, of course, this has to be asked, which is better, the city life or the rural life? Because it seems like there are tremendous advantages to living in a city just at a practical level. You have proximity to work. There's all this opportunity for connection, for meeting people and all that kind of thing. But something core to our identity is lost when you go there too. And in the countryside, it seems like you're sacrificing so much opportunity for learning and growth and social interactions and these kinds of tensions between other people that give rise to greater self-understanding. Not, I'm sounding like Hegel now. And language and stuff. Whereas out in the country, it seems like you would gradually lose even the need for language, by degrees, of course. But
yeah, naturally.
But
I would
it
say
comes with
that
these other benefits as well.
it's about real community, because if you see the cities itself, in the city that you live in, are you a community?
Not really.
Yeah, I don't know my fucking neighbors. I don't like.
Yeah.
That's
Well,
the
I
difference.
know my neighbors in the current city I live. I moved from the greater Seattle area to a smaller town further east. I won't be too specific, but we'll say the inland northwest, where things are smaller. I think our town has 3,000 to 5,000 people. It might be more than that, but
I mean, yeah, that's significantly different. So therein lies that you can actually have a community, at least on a smaller scale in your immediate area. But I would say this is most people who live in the city, no, they have a vague sense of community, but no, they don't have that.
it's more abstract.
It's
It's an
abstract, and
idea.
it's not personable. That's the other
Yeah.
thing is relationships and community is personable. Like villages and rural areas are inherently tribal.
Yeah. And so my sense is that to manage a city and to manage the distrust that is inborn in our nature, you have to begin with an ideal form of what an ideal person will look like and instill that in the population from the top down, which is like kind of tough to do, and everyone's going to fail, and so you need forgiveness, and it's and of course it's set, it's a static thing, whereas in a rural environment, A, that's not really feasible or possible, but B, the bottom up negotiation between personalities and figuring out where our boundaries are and what our relationships are to each other in that organic fashion is actually possible and meaningful, because the person you see today, you're probably going to see again next week. Whereas if you rip someone off in a city, you're probably never going to see them again.
I mean, it's more personable and it's more realistic, and I would say it's more human. That's the other thing. It's more human because it's less mechanical, because people are working together in a lot of ways. They're actually intertwined in each other's lives. They're actually dealing with each other on a daily basis. Like, my boy Mick, he knows all of his fucking neighbors, and he lives 30 minutes away from Waldgang. He knows all of them.
Yeah.
And he can spout off, oh, that's so and so over there. I know him. You've known him for like 10 fucking years. I'm like, interesting. Okay. Yeah, he was a little fucker when he was growing up. So he knows everybody. He knows their character. He knows who they are. You go out to a city, you can say, oh, I know such and such. I don't fucking know who that is. He lives on the other side of town, and he probably has like his own fucking 15 different friend groups.
Right.
It's not as human. It's not as personable, and it's a little bit more. It's built off of a tribal context, I would say, and cities are naturally not tribal unless they have a singular identity, which more often than not doesn't happen because most cities actually become flooded with different nationalities and different religions or anything.
So if you don't have Jesus, you at least need to have the Raiders to stand in as for your coming together identity.
You and your fucking sports ball.
Right. Raiders were the first team that came. I suppose I should have thought of the Seahawks, but yeah, I follow it very closely.
I would have thought about that too, and it actually makes me wretched to think that.
I don't mind sports when I'm getting to play them. It's the watching and the deep identification with the teams that feels a little.
It's artificial tribalism, and that's by design.
Yeah, you feel like a bit of a chump's not quite the right word, but it's kind of close. You feel like a kind of weird psychological pawn in some strange put on thing.
It's bread and circuses, my dude. Bread and circuses. We all know that. And that's okay. People need entertainment, but there's a difference where you culturally identify as this thing, and there's riots and shit like that, like over your team, or you get into fights or stabbings about it. That's religion. That's what that is. That's fucking religion. Holy
the European football clubs needs to know how to do it right. Oh man, I love it. Well, I think I don't want to keep you too much longer. I do want to point people to the excellent blog you've been building up, and which I'll leave in the link here. Can you say that for people who might be listening though?
Yeah, it's ClintonJMcMillan.com. It's just my name. It's actually on my link in my bio on Instagram.
Okay.
And yeah, a lot of that is just etymological and theological breakdowns. I pride myself on deconstruction. That's really how I understand theology and the world around me, and how I break down myth, because I've made the joke before that I'm actually not a reconstructionist, I'm a deconstructionist. So and it actually, what it does is it fleshes out true understanding of these words themselves and where they derive from, and how we can look at it in a different form, a different sense. In my opinion, a more naturalistic sense.
Well, and before someone accuses you of being postmodernist, I in my own personal reading of your deconstructions, what I find on the other side is a deeper construction of the concept in question. So it's like we're deconstructing this superficial notion of what Thor is, and in that deconstruction, finding the deeper, more meaningful and more spiritually powerful core of the concept of Thor that has been pasted over with gross, childish, colors and movies and crap.
Yeah, and it's looking at it from a different lens, and I take the words for what they are and then try to apply them in context of ritual and myth. A lot of the times I'll take myth apart. Like my notes look like a fucking schizophrenic on meth. Straight
like
up.
The red yarn guy with the
That's
conspiracy theory.
That's my brain. But the thing is I try and deconstruct myth and look at it within context and actually understand where it comes from, what it derives from, what the words actually mean, and how it can be used. I think a lot of times we forget the deeper meaning when we're looking at myth itself or just the legend. We're thinking about the event. We're thinking about the chain of events within it and the story. We're thinking about the story. We're not
Yeah.
thinking about what lies behind it. And every myth and every story ever has some type of message behind it. If we look at pagan myth,
Right.
it more often than not, when we look at the names of gods, they all derive from words for phenomena. That's it.
And there's a certain kind of, I don't want to elevate this too hard because it's not really my style, but there is a kind of deeper reverence that you can find on the other side of from a slightly irreverent and deconstructive approach to these things, which is why I love talking. And we didn't totally get into the Snorri thing with the how Odin got in there, but so much of the reverence people have for Odin is arguably quite misplaced, especially of Odin as a sky father. And like it would be a shame to live with that kind of misplaced thing if there is a deeper truth that a little bit of irreverence, not even irreverence, just not with a kind of objective lens. We're not taking these stories with reverence necessarily in order to get to the deeper truth about the universe and our lives and our relationship to it that we want to appreciate more completely and is more worth appreciating.
Yeah, and I think when you, in a mechanical way, break it down, I would say in an atheistic way, and break it down, you can try and place it in this almost sterile form, which I completely reject, because I look at it as a spiritual task. It helps me understand the myth more intuitively and appreciate it. And it makes me look at it from a different lens. I mean, sometimes I rewrite them. Sometimes I rewrite them in a naturalistic, fucking animistic sense. And to me, because it translates better to me that way. What would this look like? What would the myth look like if it stayed this way? What would the story be? How would it be more reverent? How would people appreciate it more? How would they look at it? And how would they internalize it into their lives? A lot of times, we go into the emulation feature within stories and mythology, which you've covered extensively. It's one of those features within, they look at these figures as heroes. They look at it and they want to become like them. And that's okay, but then when you cut through it, you look at it for its deeper meaning and like the operations of the world itself. And I think a lot of people forget that within mythology.
Yeah. Oh, totally. And it's one of those things that people, will probably continue to forget, but there's always that singular truth to return to, however many times you forget. it's always there to return to at the end of the day.
Yeah, it's a process. I mean, to understand it, it's a lifelong thing, and that's one of the reasons why I do what I do, because I did it mostly for myself. Is like, I'm just going to obsess about this shit for a number of years and figure this shit out. And hopefully some people will learn a little bit from it. That's literally it.
Well, exactly. And it's my hope on this podcast to, among other things, bring more eyes to otherwise obscure and esoteric people who are just so underrated and, in my opinion, invaluable in a deeper view of living well. And if I can bring just 2 or 3 people away from Rachel Maddow and Tucker Carlson to people like Greg Naj and you, and Curtis Yarvin and Ben Brower and all these other interesting people who've explored these ideas and taken them to depths most people don't take these ideas, and tragically settle for superficialities. I think the world, but more importantly, their own lives, would be better, and everyone would have a much better time, because there's so much deeper and higher pleasures than the superficial outrage and the sort of self-righteous self-satisfaction with superficialities that we so often settle for.
And it also makes them think a little bit fucking more. That's the other thing.
Which makes the world a more interesting place.
Fuck yeah, it does.
So, Clinton, thanks so much for coming on. Any final words to say?
Yeah, Hail Waldgang.
Hail Waldgang, indeed.